Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, day one of jury deliberations in former President Trump's New York criminal case ends without a verdict. The jury is asking to review testimony as they decide whether to convict Trump. Iris Tao has the trial's latest and Trump's latest comments from the courthouse. The jury is also asking to hear their instructions again. Arlene Richards joins us to break down how those instructions are key to the whole case. Israel Defense Forces have reported taking full operational control of the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. What impact will this have on the war in the Gaza Strip? Jason Perry has the war update. States over 1,000 miles from the southern border aren't immune to the immigration crisis. Congressmen traveled to North Dakota today, probing how the crisis affects places across the country. A case of the highly pathogenic bird flu is detected at a large egg farm in Iowa. More than 4 million chickens will have to be slaughtered.
This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Jurors in Trump's New York trial now on their way home without reaching a verdict today. The former president again calls it a rigged trial as President Biden attacks him at a campaign event. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao reports from the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse.
The jurors have now been dismissed after deliberating for more than 5 hours today, though without reaching a unanimous verdict on whether or not to convict Trump. And Trump after court today again insisting that there's no crime and complaining about certain witnesses not getting called.
I mean, what is very unfair is that I'm not campaigning. I'm in this room all day long, from morning to night, in the Biden witch hunt. Take a look at where the people come from. It's a Biden witch hunt. It's weaponization. So it seems that there are a lot of witnesses, a lot of people that they could have called that they didn't call. The other thing, the confusion is, nobody knows what the crime is, because there's no crime. Nobody knows what the crime is.
During deliberations in the afternoon, the jury sent 2 notes when asking to review specific testimonies by former tabloid publisher David Pecker and former Trump attorney Michael Cohen. The other note asking to rehear jury instructions as they weren't giving them on paper. The request could take hours to fulfill, and court will resume on Thursday morning. Earlier on Wednesday, the judge in his jury instructions told the jurors to set aside their personal biases and focus solely on the facts and the evidence. He also told them that they have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt about the charges to find the defendant guilty. But the judge also told them that they don't have to agree unanimously on what crime Trump is trying to hide through allegedly falsifying business records. And that's a major sticking point, as Trump's been insisting that he did not falsify business records, let alone trying to hide another underlying crime.
Today, Donald Trump is pandering and peddling lies and stereotypes for your vote so he can win.
Meanwhile, President Biden on Wednesday attacked Trump at a Philadelphia campaign event.
Donald Trump will have a message for you. Not in our house and not on our watch.
And the White House would not confirm recent reporting that Biden will speak from the White House about the upcoming verdict. And that's as the Biden campaign on Tuesday sent surrogates to right outside the Trump courthouse to hold a surprise press conference, a move that Trump on Wednesday said was to influence the trial. Reporting from New York City, Iris Tao, NTD News.
We turn now to our legal correspondent, Arlene Richards, for an in-depth look at the deliberations and the jury instructions. Arlene, thank you so much for joining us. Now, the jury has completed its first day of deliberations. What happens during these deliberations?
Well, of course, they will consider all of the evidence that was presented to them, as well as the charges in this case. And if we can just bring up the slide now so that we can go over other things that they're going to consider. So they did receive a copy of all of the evidence that was admitted at trial. And if they are confused about anything, they can ask the judge questions by sending him a handwritten note, which, Iris Tao said they did earlier today. They can also ask to have witness testimony read back to them, or they can have the jury instructions read back to them, which they did request. And if the judge receives the question, then all of the attorneys must come back into the courtroom to help the judge determine how best to respond to that. So Trump and all of his attorneys had to stay in the courthouse all day today, just in case there was a question. And this is how it will go each day until they either reach a verdict or there is a mistrial.
Now, the judge spent nearly 2 hours today delivering jury instructions, but several legal experts have said the judge's instructions make it easier for the jury to convict Trump. What is the main concern here?
Well, last week, the judge allowed the attorneys to weigh in on what they thought should be contained in these instructions. Now, the charge is that there is a falsification of business records in furtherance of another crime, and that this is what elevated this business records charge to a felony. So if we can just bring up the other slide that I have today. So the defense argued that the jurors should be required to agree on what that other crime is. And now the prosecution has raised 3 possible crimes: tax evasion, violations of federal election law, and violation of state election law. But the prosecution says they don't have to, the law doesn't require them to specifically state what that crime is. And so this is what the problem is. But the judge agreed with the prosecution. So if some of the juries, this is how it could work, if some of the jurors believe that Trump falsified business records in furtherance of a tax crime, some of them could believe that he falsified business records in furtherance of one of these election crimes. And they don't have to agree on that, and they can still convict him on a felony level of falsification of business records. And this is what a lot of legal experts are saying is totally wrong here. Some have even said that there is Supreme Court cases that have shown that the prosecution has to identify what that specific crime is, and the jury has to agree with it.
And given that, Arlene, if Trump is convicted, the defense will most likely appeal. What are some issues they could raise in appeal?
Well, there may be several issues, but what sticks out for me is the testimony of Stormy Daniels and this jury instruction. So Stormy Daniels, when she testified, right after that, the defense asked for a mistrial. And they said that, her testimony was so salacious about this, alleged affair that she had with Trump that it was highly prejudicial. Now, the judge denied their motion for a mistrial, and he said that they had not objected enough at the time of her testimony. But before she even got on the stand, the defense had asked the judge to limit what she could say and to limit the questions that the prosecution could ask, and he denied that. So I think this is going to be one of the things at the top of their list. And as I said, with the jury instructions, the defense argued vigorously last week about what changes should be made, specifically this having the jury to agree on what the crime is. And of course, as we know, that didn't happen. The judge seemed to be denying them at every turn last week. So I expect that to be also at the top of their list if they have to appeal, of course, if Trump is convicted.
Arlene, thanks for those updates.
All right, thank you.
Israel Defense Forces have reported making more progress during their ground operations in Rafah in southern Gaza. The IDF said they now have full operational control of the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. NTD's Jason Perry has the update.
Israel Defense Forces have been conducting ground operations in Rafah for a few weeks now. And on Wednesday, the IDF announced more progress, saying it now has full control of the entire border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. This strip of land is also known as the Philadelphia Corridor.
The Philadelphia Corridor served as an oxygen line for Hamas, through which it carried out weapons smuggling into Gaza on a regular basis. Our forces located along the corridor dozens of loaded launchers prepared to fire rockets, launching pits from which Hamas fired rockets and mortars to Israeli territory.
He also added that control of the corridor will prevent Hamas from smuggling weapons into the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken raised his concerns over the war in Gaza while speaking in Moldova on Wednesday, saying Israel does not have a plan for the day after the war is over.
A plan for the day after that does not leave Israel responsible for Gaza, which it says it does not want to be. But if it is, it will simply have an enduring insurgency on its hands for as far as one can see into the future. Or not, if not, Hamas will be left in charge, which is unacceptable. Or if not, we'll have chaos, lawlessness, and a vacuum that eventually will be filled again by Hamas, or maybe something, if it's possible to imagine, even worse, jihadis.
Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, residents continue to flee for safety as the battle between Israel and Hamas rages on.
The situation is scary with all the shelling. The children are scared. We have no place left to stay. This is the 7th time we have been displaced from where we were, going from one place to another.
Although Israel has been making significant progress in Rafah, the fighting appears to be far from over. Israel's national security advisor said the war in the Gaza Strip will continue at least throughout 2024. Jason Perry, NTD News.
As Ukraine receives more military aid from the U.S. and allies, a key question remains: can Ukraine use the weapons to strike targets inside Russia? Secretary of State Antony Blinken comments on the possibility.
We haven't encouraged or enabled strikes outside of Ukraine, but Ukraine, as I've said before, has to make its own decisions about the best way to effectively defend itself. We're going to make sure that it has the equipment it needs to do that.
Blinken says that going forward, the U.S. will continue to adapt and adjust as necessary. He says the U.S. is always making decisions about what's necessary to make sure that Ukraine can effectively defend itself. Blinken's comments come as France and Germany said Tuesday that Ukraine should be allowed to use their weapons against targets inside Russia. Some congressmen say they worry every state has become a border state. A group traveled from D.C. to North Dakota today, examining the nationwide impact of the border crisis. NTD's Virginia Gibson has more.
Where is the outrage from the American people? How can we sit back and watch this dereliction of duty?
Republicans from a House Judiciary Subcommittee held a hearing in North Dakota on Wednesday, probing how the border crisis affects states across the country. The subcommittee's chairman says the 2 million known gotaways pose a great risk to the nation.
Are some of those terrorists, and how long do you think we've got?
The vastness of the numbers is part of the problem, but the fact that they were allowed in here, they're here, and we don't talk about sleeper cells anymore. Well, they're asleep at the moment, but they can be awakened in an instant.
And illegal immigrants who are being processed can pose a risk too, especially if they're not being processed near the southern border. A North Dakota sheriff says they don't have the systems in place to handle illegal immigrants.
We don't have access to checking criminal histories like our federal partners do. And without understanding what people's criminal histories are and being given the direction to that they can't do anything, that we should just let them go, that doesn't give us a good feeling, because now we're letting someone go and we don't have any idea who they are.
States across the U.S. might be more affected by the fentanyl crisis than states down south. North Dakota's Attorney General says that's because of the huge profits in states that aren't near the border.
The gangs have identified an opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, a 2-day drive to North Dakota with pills that cost you a dime, 15 cents, or a quarter on a bad day, and you're fetching $60 a pill on average up here. The profits are astronomical.
He added that many of the pills are then being sold to people who are already addicted, but not all. Some are being pushed onto new people to make them addicted. Virginia Gibson, NTD News.
Over 4 million chickens must be killed, Iowa officials determine after detecting signs of bird flu. Officials say the risk to public health is low. Here's the story.
Over 4 million chickens in Iowa will have to be killed after officials detected signs of bird flu, deadly and highly infectious for birds. Officials say the risk to public human health is currently low.
The culling of the chickens is not about humans. The culling of the chickens is about protecting the chicken industry.
Dr. Robert Malone says they don't want the disease to spread to animals in other states. Only 3 human beings have reportedly caught the bird flu in the U.S., and none experienced serious health problems. Malone says chicken culling is a decades-old policy. He believes it's debatable whether it's the best policy, but he does think it's defensible. He also says it doesn't hurt farmers too much.
They usually have insurance in case this happens. So in the short term, what it's going to do is reduce availability. It's going to make it harder to get chicken in some regions. But the chicken industry is geographically dispersed.
Bird flu is, however, battering the industry. The disease has annihilated over 92 million birds since last February, leading to rising egg and chicken prices.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Hong Kong police have arrested 6 people for posting on social media. They are accused of inciting hatred against Hong Kong leaders. Under the new update to Hong Kong's national security law, those arrested could face harsher penalties. NTD's Jack Bradley has the details.
In a new escalation in what appears to be Hong Kong's deteriorating rule of law, 5 women and 1 man were arrested on Tuesday by Hong Kong police. Now, this appears to be because of social media posts against the Hong Kong government, which is handpicked by the Chinese Communist Party. It's the first public arrests under its new national security law called Article 23, a policy imposed by the Chinese Communist Party. It expands on the national security law back in 2020, giving harsher penalties for treason and sedition, and allows trials to be held behind closed doors. Members of Congress held a hearing last week over the Chinese regime's influence over Hong Kong.
When the Chinese Communist Party breaks its word to respect the freedom of Hong Kong through one country, 2 systems, it's breaking its word to the entire world.
Instead, what we see is 1 country, 1 system, 1 party, 1 ruler, Xi Jinping.
Religious groups persecuted by the Chinese regime are now facing increasing pressure in Hong Kong, like Falun Gong, a spiritual practice based on truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. The Congressional Executive Commission on China published its annual report earlier this month, listing several cases of suppression against Falun Gong in China. The report cited incidents of arrested practitioners tortured to death or severe injury in prison by Chinese authorities. Meanwhile, 47 pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong are set to receive a verdict on their cases this week. They're charged with subversion and could face up to life in prison. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
A rare peek into the inner workings of China's secret police operation. A former Chinese spy spilled the beans after defecting to Australia. He spoke with NTD about Beijing's tactics to snatch dissidents overseas.
A confession from a former Chinese spy. For 15 years, he worked as an undercover agent, helping Beijing track dissidents around the world and lure them back to China.
Anyone that's against the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping could become a target.
The former spy goes by the name Eric. After defecting to Australia, he's now going public, lifting the veil on a global operation to snatch those critical of Beijing. Key to the operation is a unit inside China's top police agency called the First Bureau. It's in charge of agents like Eric.
It's a bit like Stasi, the KGB, or Gestapo of Nazi Germany. As a political repression tool, it has only one goal, and that is to maintain the Chinese Communist Party's control.
And that includes controlling voices outside China's borders. Eric was but one agent spinning China's web across the globe, tracking dissidents and waiting for the right moment to bait and trap them. According to reports from Safeguard Defenders, Chinese authorities were able to coerce 12,000 people to return to China from over 120 countries over the past decade. Many were sent back to China without even their host countries even being made aware. Eric says he was responsible for tracking down dissidents in Australia, Canada, India, Cambodia, and Thailand.
My main job was to collect information, such as getting inside the target's circle to establish relationships with them. Also to learn their plans ahead of time. You need to know what they're going to do next. This is really important, even more so than simply arresting an average person.
Here's how it works.
My handler will send over a list of targets. For example, if they want to coerce someone to return to China, and I would talk to them to come up with a plan for how to approach that person online and in person, to see if I could lure them to a place where it's easier to take control of him.
One of the targets was a political cartoonist called Red Pepper. His satirical cartoons often mock the Chinese Communist Party and its leader Xi Jinping.
It was about the end of 2016. Eric messaged me on Twitter saying he liked my cartoons and wanted to chat privately. We later communicated through email. He approached me as someone that was pro-democracy.
Posing as a real estate agent, Eric asked Red Pepper to design a logo for a project. It went smoothly.
I only knew years later that this was a trap to win my trust.
Once the logo was done, Eric extended another job offer with one condition, that Red Pepper had to go to Cambodia for the job interview.
But I have a bad impression of Southeast Asian countries, that they're not safe. I don't trust them because of their human rights records, especially Cambodia. So I replied to him saying I wouldn't go.
Thailand, Burma, Laos, these countries are the top choices for Chinese secret police trying to catch dissidents. Local governments turn a blind eye to Chinese operations and sometimes even work with Chinese agents.
Red Pepper was in the dark about the plan to snatch him until a reporter from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation reached out to him to confirm Eric's story.
Turns out the Eric that was in communication with me defected.
Eric said he was coerced into working as a spy and always wanted to flee. Asked why he went public with his closely guarded secrets,
Of course I have my own reasons. Some of them I can't really disclose. But also like what the news report said, it fits into my values. I have always believed that the inner workings of these secret worlds should be disclosed one day.
He said only by understanding the dark side of those in power can the public better monitor its government.
A major political shift could be underway in South Africa. Polling stations opened today in the country, which has been dominated by a single party since the end of apartheid.
Voting was underway on Wednesday in South Africa's most competitive election since the end of apartheid. Opinion polls suggest the ruling African National Congress is heading for a first ever loss of its parliamentary majority in 30 years of government.
I understand that it's a very important decision to make. So yes, I'm excited, but very nervous because it is a big decision. Yeah, 30 years of democracy is a very long way that we've come. So I just want to continue to help our country get to a better place.
If the ANC does fall short of 50% of the vote, then it will need to make a deal with one or more smaller parties to govern. Opposition parties in this vote include the pro-business Democratic Alliance, the Marxist Economic Freedom Fighters, and the newly formed MK Party, led by former President Jacob Zuma. Voters are electing assemblies in each of South Africa's 9 provinces and a new national parliament, which will then choose the next president. The ANC is still expected to pick up the biggest share of votes. And that means incumbent President Cyril Ramaphosa is likely to stay in office unless he faces an internal challenge. However, this election does look set to mark a major political shift in a country that has been dominated by a single party for decades. The ANC's gradual fall from grace has been driven by dissatisfaction over high rates of unemployment and crime, frequent power blackouts, and corruption in party ranks. More than 27 million South Africans are registered to vote, and the Electoral Commission is expected to start releasing partial results within hours of polling stations closing.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us now, here's some of today's top headlines. The Israeli military announced more progress in Rafah, saying it now has full control of the entire border between Gaza Strip and Egypt, known as the Philadelphia Corridor. Meanwhile, Israel's national security advisor said the war will continue at least throughout 2024. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. will continue to adapt and adjust its support for Ukraine. This came as France and Germany said that Ukraine should be allowed to use their weapons against targets inside Russia. Lawmakers from the House Judiciary Committee traveled to North Dakota to examine the impact of the border crisis on states far from the southern border. Local officials testify that North Dakota is hurting from the fentanyl crisis and threats to public safety from mass illegal immigration. Jury deliberation began in former President Trump's New York criminal trial. The jurors went home without a verdict on the first day and will resume tomorrow morning. Joining me now to discuss the first day of jury deliberations in Trump's case is Gerard Filitti, senior counsel at the Lawfare Project. Gerard, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you again. Now, to begin, what is your take on the jury instructions, particularly the part where the jury doesn't have to agree on what the underlying crime is?
Well, that particular instruction is problematic for a lot of attorneys because it flies in the face of what we understand the basic principles of criminal law to be, which is namely that you are charged with a specific crime, you know what that crime is, and the prosecution has to prove its elements. What we have here is an instruction that the jury just has to agree that Trump committed a felony. They don't need to agree which underlying predicate act is that felony. For example, whether it was a falsification of records in order to get a benefit in the election, whether it was for tax purposes or some other purpose. All they need to find is that he committed basically the misdemeanor without going into detail as to what the felony is, and that's just abnormal.
Now, the jury came back with 2 notes today, one asking to rehear testimony about David Pecker and Michael Cohen in that meeting at Trump Tower, and another to rehear legal instructions from the judge. Now, noted legal scholar Jonathan Turley is saying the jury's request for instructions is, quote, particularly interesting because there wouldn't be a need unless there's an early disagreement in that room on the evidence and the standards. What's your view on this?
My view is that the instructions themselves were confusing. It's easy to see how jurors can be confused by the somewhat contradictory statements about what needs to be proven and reconciling that with what they heard. There were some aspects of the jury instructions that were quite good for Trump, actually. For example, when the judge instructed the jury that the mere fact that he was present for a meeting does not mean that he was a conspirator to anything. I think that when the jury asks questions about jury instructions, it shows that they were not necessarily confused by the words of the instructions themselves, but they're trying to reconcile the instructions with the evidence that they heard. So that generally is a good sign for the defense. That being said, New York does something unusual that other states don't do. They don't provide the written instructions to the jury. They need to recall and take notes what the judge said. So having questions about the instructions is pretty normal at this stage.
And Gerard, what else should we be paying attention to while deliberations continue?
The other thing to be paying attention to is what the jury asks for clarification on, or what evidence they ask to rehear, what from the transcript they ask to rehear. And that can be quite contentious. We saw that today when they asked to be read back portions of testimony about a meeting that took place at Trump Tower. And even there it's contentious because Trump's team and the prosecution disagree on how much of that testimony is relevant to the jury's request. Too little context and the jury may still be confused. Too much context and it may give them an idea that one thing or another happened. It may predetermine their decision. So there's a lot of caution to be exercised even by the judge as to what juries hear in terms of the evidence that they've already seen.
Zooming out on the political front, how could a guilty verdict impact the election?
We've seen Donald Trump play these trials to his political advantage, and a guilty verdict would probably still play to his advantage. Many Americans are expressing outrage that he's being prosecuted. Many Americans, even left of center, have expressed outrage that these charges seem to be politicized. And I think Trump will only see an increase in his support if he is convicted. I don't think that it will harm him politically, although it will be a problem legally that will still need to be reconciled before the election and before any inauguration.
Now, it's almost certain that Trump will appeal if he is convicted. Now, what grounds could his legal team use? How long would that process take?
The process would take months. It would last well beyond the election, and it would be an appeal of everything from rulings that were made during trial, what evidence could or could not be presented, the exclusion of some of Trump's witnesses because they wanted to testify to things that the judge disagreed with, the jury instructions themselves. All of this would be raised on appeal. Every single decision that the judge ruled on during the trial, every single jury instruction, all of these would be up for appeal, and an appellate court would have to look at each one. So that's a process that would take a long time and well beyond the November election.
Gerard Filitti, Senior Counsel at the Lawfare Project, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.
Plastic bags, paper bags, or tote bags, different ways people can carry items out of stores. In California, stores have been offering reusable plastic bags, but some lawmakers want to limit them in the future. NTD's David Lamb asked shoppers for their thoughts.
What do people think about reusable plastic bags? We spoke to some folks in Silicon Valley to find out.
Actually, I don't like it. I every time using my oven bags because a lot of plastic around world in the ocean.
I usually keep the plastic bags that we have for things at home.
I think plastic bags will go right into, the mass that's in our ocean.
California lawmakers recently voted to approve 2 bills that would restrict grocery stores and retailers from offering reusable thick plastic bags. The state already put restrictions on thin single-use bags in 2014, preventing most grocery stores, retail stores, and convenience stores from distributing them, but it reportedly did not reduce plastic consumption as expected.
If it is banned, then we have to make sure that the alternative is very available. For example, maybe jute bag or some paper bags, this kind of things. If they are available, then we can replace them very easily.
I think that'd be smart. I mean, it's too convenient to just pay 10 cents for a bag and use it. You know, it's going to make people remember to either bring their totes or use paper.
State Senator Catherine Blakespear, who co-authored Assembly Bill 2236 along with Senator Ben Allen, argued that consumers actually don't reuse or recycle the thicker plastic bags. Stores usually charge at least 10 cents for plastic bags.
The customer doesn't have to pay on their own. That would be very good, actually, and it would be a very good culture. In many countries, the customer don't pay themselves.
Reusable bags are the way to go. I personally use them. I have some from Trader Joe's. I have some from Whole Foods, Safeway. It's very, very easy. Easy step in your daily routine.
If approved and signed, the reusable plastic bag ban would be effective starting in 2026 in California. David Lamb, NTD News, California.
Inflation and the long-reaching effects of COVID-19 lockdowns have hit small businesses and their owners hard. But over 98% of businesses in New York City are small businesses. NTD's Fiona G was at the NYC Small Business Month Expo today. She spoke to government officials as well as many small business owners.
We want to make sure that they are aware of what resources are available. And by bringing everyone under one roof, you can not only get access to the resources, but you also cross-pollinate with other small businesses.
I think the main challenge for small businesses are getting access to funding and also just cutting through red tape.
The first ever New York City Small Business Month Expo has drawn together hundreds of small business owners. I had a chance to talk to a few of them to get to know about the challenges they're facing as well as the help they're hoping to get.
In recent years, the rents have gone up a tremendous amount. So to have a retail business or even a wholesale business, you need to pay a large amount of rent. And, and you have to put down a deposit of a couple months security. Also, when it comes to legal advice, it's expensive to hire a lawyer.
A lot of small businesses really suffered from pandemic, and there's business owners like us who opened in the middle of pandemic. So we have a lack of resources, food price changes, a lot of issues with, the hiring for team members with the minimum wage increase and etc. So those has been really challenges. We have a thin margin in the restaurant industry, food services. So try to keep the restaurant afloat has been challenged. This is very devastating. I've seen some of the restaurant owners in our street, in the Flatiron, they're closing down the business. They're struggling with the finances and inflations, and so they ended up closing down the businesses.
I am here at the Expo to get my camp out in the open. It's a diabetes camp for type 1 diabetic children who have challenges of going to a traditional camp because there are no healthcare staff on site to help them administer insulin. Honestly, the greatest challenge is finding a location suitable for these children because they are a very challenging population.
The fabric of New York City's vibrant culture is built on small businesses. Despite financial and economic hardships brought on by COVID and inflation, both small business owners and government officials alike say they have a hopeful outlook for the future. Fiona G, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer now for your sports news. We're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on in sports today, but let's start in golf, where the criminal charges against Scottie Scheffler have been dropped. What was the reason given?
The local prosecutor said based on the totality of the evidence, they cannot move forward with the case. And he also said that the characterization of the incident being a big misunderstanding was corroborated by the evidence. Now, Scheffler had been charged with felony for assaulting a police officer and 3 other misdemeanors. His attorney had previously said he would plead not guilty and was not interested in a plea plea bargain, so this seemed like an all or nothing case. And I think it really seems very likely that the officer not having his body cam activated for this incident played a large role in this. You know, the only police footage available showed the officer running towards Scheffler's car on foot and then getting Scheffler out and putting him in cuffs. Now, authorities say that the footage failed to show the officer's first encounter with Scheffler. Now, the officer is identified as Detective Brian Gillis, said Scheffler refused to comply, accelerated forward, dragging him to the ground. Gillis was taken to a hospital for injuries to his knee and wrist. In any case, Scheffler spent a couple minutes in jail, then headed back to the second round of the PGA Championship, where he played great, finished 8th overall. But in any case, it looks like we finally have an end to probably the biggest story in golf in quite a long time.
Well, shifting gears to basketball news, LeBron James's agent Rich Paul says LeBron's son, Bronny James, will stay in the upcoming NBA draft. How much could LeBron impact where his son is drafted?
You know, that is what everyone wants to see right now, because LeBron can opt out and become a free agent and sign with any team he wants. Now, of course, when I say any team that can afford his salary. I mean, last year he made $47 million. Of course, he can sign for whatever he wants, but that would be a starting point. Not in too many teams have that kind of cap space. But maybe the team that drafts him does have that cap space. And LeBron has previously stated one of his goals was to play with his sons in the NBA. Now, Bronny's stock price or draft stock is a little unclear. Like a year ago, he was a McDonald's All-American as a high school player, so it was very high. But then he suffered that cardiac arrest last summer. He got off to a slow start at UFC, never quite got going. I think he finished 8th on his own team in scoring at 5 points a game. But, you know, there have been players that have been drafted based on their play in high school, and he's done very well at the workouts. So this is going to be the biggest story heading into next month's draft.
Looking at baseball news, the historical records of the Negro Leagues were officially incorporated into baseball's major league records on a Tuesday. How has this impacted the all-time leaders, if at all?
You know, as far as like percentage-based leaders, like batting average or slugging percentage, there are some new leaders. You know, for instance, Ty Cobb had the highest career batting average at 367. This was like over 100 years ago he played. But now with these integrated Negro League stats, Josh Gibson has taken over at 372. And he's also the #1 in career slugging percentage and OPS, which is slugging percentage plus on-base percentage. Babe Ruth had actually been first in that. It's the same for season stats, but for season totals and career totals, there's not much difference, because although Major League Baseball had this 154-game schedule and then a 162-game schedule, the Negro League seasons were much, much shorter. So as far as like, you know, home runs and RBIs and runs scored and all those things, they're not being impacted at this point. Now, there could be more statistics added. They estimate that 72% of the Negro League's play has been included in here. They said they could go back and add some more. It's a long process, though, because you have to go through old newspapers from like 100 years ago, but could be more added anyway.
Tonight we have one NHL playoff game. It's Game 4 between the Stars and Oilers. Now, Dallas has a 2-1 lead, but Edmonton's Connor McDavid sounded confident that his team could bounce back. What has Dallas done to slow them?
Well, for one thing, they've stopped Edmonton's power play unit. I mean, in a couple of different ways. They've only gotten 5 penalties in 3 games thus far, and all 5 times they were able to kill the power play. So they're 0 for 5, Edmonton is. But that confidence from McDavid, that's what you want to hear from him. He's a 3-time league MVP, and he simply said, quote, "There's a belief in our room that we can respond to situations like this. I know it'll be the same tonight." Now, tonight's game will be played in Edmonton, and the winner of this series will go to the Stanley Cup Finals.
Well, Davis Owens, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
A new book is out telling the stories of detransitioners. It's called Detrans: True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. Earlier, we spoke with the author of the book, Mary Margaret Olahan, who also works as a senior reporter for the Daily Signal, covering culture and politics. Mary Margaret Olahan, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, to begin, your book, Detrans: True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult, just came out. What was the initial spark behind why you wrote this book?
I wrote this book because I noticed that these were stories that were springing up about young people who had tried to do the unthinkable, to transition to another gender. And then once they had gone through hormonal or surgical procedures, realized that they could not actually do that. And so they tried to live again as their biological sex. And I noticed that the establishment media was refusing to tell these stories and refusing to give a platform to these people, and meanwhile pushing gender ideology down the throats of everyday Americans. And so when I got an opportunity to write a book, I knew exactly what I wanted to write about, because these are really important stories. These are people who have been manipulated and lied to, and they deserve to have a voice.
And in your process of writing this book, what was the most surprising aspect that you uncovered?
I think perhaps I was most surprised by the empathy that I felt for parents in all of this. And I should caveat that by saying there are certainly parents out there who, for selfish and narcissistic reasons, they push their children to transition out of a desire to promote themselves. You know, it's a desire to talk about it at a cocktail party or to post about it on Instagram. That's a very evil thing. But what I found when I was writing this book was that most of the parents who were involved in their children's gender transitions, it was their child coming to them and saying, I think that I am a boy, for example, and I need to get hormones and undergo surgery to be happy, because that's what these activists are telling them. And the parents love their kids. They want what's best for them. They don't want their daughter to undergo a double mastectomy, but they think, okay, I'm going to take her to a mental health professional. They'll know what to do. And when they get there, the mental health professional says, you have to affirm your child or she'll commit suicide. And the direct quote that they say to them is, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son? And that is incredibly horrible. It is a threat to parents, basically saying, if you don't affirm your child, they'll kill themselves and it will be your fault. This is a really horrible thing. And, you know, these parents, they're not equipped politically to deal with this. They're not really sure what we're talking about here. And granted, they should do more research, but they unfortunately trust medical professionals and allow their kids to go down this route.
And for those young people who did decide to transition, perhaps due to social pressure, what did you find out in your research about the choices that led to them to choose to then detransition?
Yeah, I think a lot of the young people's realization moment came after, unfortunately, they had been on hormones and after they had undergone surgery. And it was kind of a moment of them realizing, I was told I would feel better after I went through all of this. I was told that this would alleviate my gender dysphoria. And then they're finding out, oh, wait, I don't feel better. In fact, I feel worse. And the reason for that is that they had a lot of underlying mental health conditions that were ignored. They were put on hormones that are bad for their body, and they underwent really invasive surgical procedures that were costly as well. And now they're realizing, wait, I don't feel better, I feel worse. And then they think, wait, I think I was lied to, and it all kind of unravels from there. But that's a horrible moment, you know, to realize that you've not only been lied to, you've been manipulated, you've been betrayed, your family's been manipulated and betrayed, and now you have to pick up the pieces of this life that you have built for yourself based on lies.
Expanding on that happiness concept, you've mentioned this in previous interviews where young people are often looking for happiness, and this gender transition ideology push is saying that that happiness lies on the other side of this gender transition, and that's something that the medical profession, many of them, have latched on. Given that, what would be your message to young people who are looking for that happiness but don't know where to turn?
Well, I would tell them what the detransitioners in my book, Chloe, Luca, Abel, Helena, and Prisha have told me, is that focus on your life in the moment. Play a sport, get out, try and make friends, focus on your studies. You know, just honor your body that you were created with, and remember that you were uniquely made. You know, there's no one else that is like you with your set of talents and interests and virtues and vices. That is unique to you. And so I think that in encouraging young people to understand that they are very unique and that they are a person created with dignity and deserving of dignity will help young people remember who they are, because we have a crisis right now of people who don't understand why they're on this earth, and whether that's for a lack of faith, a lack of family, a lack of understanding of purpose. But we need to reinvigorate our youth with purpose and understanding of their roots and where they're going and why they're even here in the first place.
Mary Margaret Allahan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.